to Executive Exchange with III. I'm Sean Kevelighan, CEO of the Insurance Information Institute, and we're talking here today with David Glawe, President and CEO of the National Insurance Crime Bureau. Welcome, Dave. How are you?
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me. Look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, great. Well, listen, just some perspective, it's now been 20 years since September 11th and the tragic terrorist attacks, and we've been discussing evolution of global risks and what they're like back then versus today, 20 years out. But first, I want to get a little bit of background from you as to where you were before this role, because I think it really gives us some perspective as to why we're going to talk to you about this evolution of terrorism and cyber threats.
Sean, thanks for the question. And 9/11 is a very somber day for the nation and for those of us that have been first responders and in the fight for terrorism since that event. And thank you for allowing me to talk a little bit about my background. But it's always been a team fight against this global war on terrorism. And I'll start from the beginning. So almost 30 years ago, I left Iowa and ended up being a Houston police officer. At the age of 22, I was the youngest patrol officer in Houston. I was fortunate enough after that to end up in Denver, Colorado, and was a U.S. Postal Inspector as a federal agent. After 9/11, the FBI had expanded their hiring. They were looking for law enforcement officers and SWAT tactical officers, and I was hired under that program. I became a counterterrorism agent in the FBI. I worked in Iraq out of Balad. I worked in Nairobi in Somalia in the fight against East African Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab, and worked up to some policy and strategy positions at the White House. And worked for the Director of National Intelligence. I was one of the first national intelligence managers for threat finance. You're probably very familiar with that position. And then evolved into the head of intelligence for U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the largest U.S. law enforcement organization. And then after President Trump was elected, I was asked by General Kelly and the president to be the head of intelligence for Department of Homeland Security and the head of intelligence for the whole United States, crafting the threat picture for the U.S. for crime, cyber, as you mentioned, foreign intelligence services, as well as terrorism. It's been an honor and a privilege to serve the country, and I look forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, thanks. It really is. It's an extraordinary experience. I was also able to serve in government roles, in particular in the Bush administration, Treasury Department, and OMB. And OMB, we were very much focused and engaged on the global war and terrorism in terms of financing. And it actually, led to me going in then to the insurance industry, which I really didn't expect to do. But one thing that for sure that brought me into the industry was when I was talking to my former employer, Zurich Insurance. They walked me through how the industry was going to very much get through the financial crisis that was beginning in 2008. And because of our safe investments and the way that we protect capital as a financial tool, as a financial first responder, so that we can be there and pay those claims. And I think that's really what we saw happen in 9/11 in the insurance industry as well. Interestingly enough, Dave, I'd be interested in kind of your anecdote as you were serving, I think, in government roles as to where you were at 9/11 at the time.
Yeah, I was in Denver, Colorado as a police officer at the time when 9/11 happened. I remember it like it was yesterday. My parents were in town visiting me. I had just gotten our first home in Denver. And I remember watching the footage of the aircraft live striking the second tower. And at that time, we all knew that this was not an accident. This was an act of terrorism. And we were a whole new environment as a country at that time. And the world had changed. We had changed, and we will forever be changed after that day. It was our Pearl Harbor event for our generation, without question. And it's amazing how we rose to the occasion to defend ourselves and recover from such a horrific attack.
Yeah, indeed. Interestingly enough, I happened to be in Denver as well at 9/11. I grew up in Colorado and was visiting my parents at the time. I was in my parents' home. So both of us were in Denver and with our parents during this tragic time, and which I know took an impact on all of us. And the industry really was there though at the time in terms of its response. At the time when a terrorist event was considered a risk, it wasn't considered a risk in any way as large as what we saw in the magnitude of 9/11. And the total insured losses of 9/11 were actually $47 billion in today's numbers. at that time as well, though policies were more vague. They didn't directly address the terrorism, and the industry did the right thing in that regard. It stepped up and it covered the claims, but it also understood that it couldn't do that again. It couldn't withstand itself from a solvency standpoint. And what actually happened, and this really is a little bit of a testament to the power that insurance brings to economic growth and stability. Once especially the commercial insurance industry knew that it wasn't going to be able to cover terrorism, you literally saw big metropolitan areas like New York in particular, Chicago, though, other Washington, D.C., where they weren't able to cover real estate or construction type of insurance policies. And those industries nearly shut down. And it did take a government to come in, a federal legislation, the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, that allowed there then to be a backstop. And that's in fact kind of where the industry had gone from paying a lot of claims, but also understanding that this risk was more out of control than they had planned. And so it does take it sometimes for a government backstop to come in for such extraordinary claims issues, even like we've just seen with the COVID-19 and a pandemic.
Sean, I have a question for you, I guess, on that. And I have a perspective, I think, now being the president and CEO for all crimes affecting the insurance industry. That's what we track from an intelligence and an operational capability we bring with our agents and analysts and with law enforcement and the carriers. But backing up a little bit, so we had some terrorist events that occurred in the United States prior to 9/11. We had the Trade Center, the first attack by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. We had Oklahoma City bombing. We had the attack from Eric Rudolph at the Olympic Park bombing. So we had some events that occurred that showed we did have risk and vulnerability. Where do you think the insurance industry was following those events? And then after 9/11, do they understand the global risk, the US risk, especially from these type of organizations? We're going to talk about cyber later. Can you give me your perspective on, is it a reactionary model where something happens and then we look at underwriting and preparing for the risk? Or is it a proactive to look at the threat picture and intelligence like we do in the national security space, and then we calculate that risk and put assets on it? Talk to me about the insurance industry and how they look at it and how they evaluate risk.
Well, I'll tell you, it's insurance is oftentimes based on data and learning from history. We're seeing a bit of a transition in that with actually having more big data. But back during 9/11, as I mentioned, that the planning and the prediction of such a large event wasn't there based on data and history. It was relatively unknown. But as they've learned from these events, and unfortunately, some of these events have increased, the industry has begun to be able to learn more about terrorism and terrorism threats. And there are some insurers that have the capital to be able to underwrite terrorism events. But there are also many other insurers that simply don't have that same capital backing. And that's why you still need, I think, the government backstop of what is the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act, or was originally. It needs to be there because it needs to be there for the stability of the broader industry. As much as we do know that there are some insurers and who can and are underwriting terrorism, we still probably do, and that's why we are and just saw a reauthorization of the legislation. So I think we're learning about this, and that's what the industry is doing. And the industry as well, to get to your question about proactiveness, the industry is really here with terrorism, but also in large on a lot of other climate-related risks and others. It's shifting itself from being one that detects the catastrophe and then comes in and repairs it, to actually predicting and preventing it, and focusing more on kind of making communities more resilient. But I think there's a careful balancing act that we need to understand as well. It's not just about underwriting and pricing risk. When you're talking about the likes of terrorism or climate related risks as well, it's also about taking proactive measures and also making sure that, to your point about law enforcement, that we're working hand in hand with law enforcement, exchanging data when it makes sense to make sure that we can, again, predict and prevent these in a way that the consumer is protected. And it's not just about that policy itself. It's more about a balanced act between government predicting, preventing, providing resilience, along with private industry doing the same, and making sure then that insurance can come in when it makes sense too.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point you bring up. So when I was the Undersecretary for Intelligence, in statute, my job was to share information with the private sector. It was stood up after 9/11, specifically for terrorism 9, but then it became all threats. Myself and Chris Wray with the FBI were the two leads for the US government on the homeland. And the one thing that I would say for the insurance industry, because we're speaking to our carrier and association members today, is investing in those partner engagement roles with the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, to get that threat risk picture, and where applicable and possible, sponsor clearances with your security officers or your intelligence hubs within your organizations. The FBI and DHS will help you with that. And I would say the financial sector, critical infrastructure, travel, energy sector, entertainment, Major League Baseball, National Basketball Association, National Football League. We had robust relationships with them. And talking to my peers, there's room to grow in the insurance industry and those relationship and partnerships. So for those of us that are listening to you and I, is engaging in those information sharing groups that DHS and FBI have. They're on their websites. We can surely go, if you contact us at NICB, we can help you with those, where to go and how to get on those organizations or engagement. But understanding the risk picture, because the national security apparatus in the United States is always going to have the most information, but it takes a whole of government and whole of community and whole of private sector approach to it, because the risk evolves globally, and it is so broad now, involving so many different industries. And we'll talk about cyber later and why it's so critical in the cyberspace.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there needs to be a exchange, a systematic approach. And again, I mean, we're talking here today about terrorism, but we're also just coming out, trying to come out, I should say, of a pandemic, which also, again, is a largely uninsurable event. We've got to make sure that we're working hand in hand with government as we're trying to predict, prevent, and protect our customers and our citizens from these threats that exist. And I'm interested on terrorism, David. Your extensive background here and the years that you've been literally had a finger on the pulse with these things. How have these threats evolved? What are the changes that you've seen in terms of the greater risks of national security and otherwise?
So thank you for that question. And it's complex in my answer. The motivation factors for terrorism generally involve political or social ideology and radical versions of it. So you're going to commit an act of violence against persons or property for change. That's in general. I'm using a kind of a simplistic term, but in general, that's what it is. And the evolution of the world in the social media platform to radicalize people online, you in the Internet of Things, has changed us dynamically, where we would have much longer in the national security space to identify these bad actors that are going to commit a violent act or recruiting others to commit a violent act. If they've moved much more rapidly in this space. What we would say from flash to bang is very short time. And we said this over and over again. I know Director Ray at the FBI has spoken about it, and I have as well. That evolution has changed. And to muster this similar like ideologies among these radicalists puts at a grave risk. And we've seen this from shootings within the United States that are either associated with domestic terrorist groups like white supremacy or radical ideology, to international terrorist organizations, either Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, all of the ones that you're very familiar with. That ideology can spread rapidly across the globe, and how we counter that is the critical component, and identify those nodes where those threat actors, those bad actors are looking to create an event, and they're trying to attack us every day. And that's why we have to invest in our national security, our law enforcement, and our private sector groups to get on top of this.
So absolutely, and it's great to get your experience in this and just understanding the extent and the nature of these threats. I had an opportunity we have every year, and you're actually going to participate this year in our joint industry forum, and I had an opportunity to have a one-on-one with Federal Reserve member Randall Quarles, another former Bush 43 colleague of ours. He mentioned, as in his mind, the largest and most worrisome threat was cyber to our economy. What type of cyber attacks keep you up at night?
Wow. That's a difficult question, because there's so many nodes that do keep me up, and they did keep me up every night, 24 hours a day in our team at the Department of Homeland Security and the National Security Council. Any attack on critical infrastructure is going to be a catastrophic event, not just for the economy, but for people. Attacking those critical nodes for transportation, communication, energy, 9/11 response systems, hospital care facilities, how you get food and water, your sustenance for life. I am fortunate, and maybe unfortunate, that I know the complete capability of our adversaries. I receive the presidential daily brief, the most sensitive briefing that we get in the United States. I received it every day. I participated in it, and I briefed the president at times. it all kept me up. And how we create that layered approach in partnership with the private sector was a key component, that we have to share information. We have to give them the capability to protect themselves, because the United States government cannot be the sole defender of the private sector. So that information sharing relationship we talked about is key to giving them information to know what our adversaries and their capability are to attack the different nodes of critical infrastructure. But we're getting better and better. We're getting better at it, but we still have significant vulnerabilities in the United States and abroad.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was able to go to an exercise with a leading think tank here where I am in Washington, D.C., talking, and it was a scenario around a terrorism event where some of the things that you were talking about got shut down, energy, different things that happened in a city. The one thing that the group was loaded with government, either former or existing, and they were all talking about how they get in there, how they get the citizens protected, how they get the things, up and running again in the short term. But one of the things that we don't think about oftentimes is the long term. And again, that's where insurance does come in. We consider ourselves a financial first responder. But and what you're saying, I think is really important, that people need to understand that this isn't just government and people getting the lights back on necessarily. It's also about making sure that we can rebuild the economies that could be damaged for the long term. Yeah. But when we're talking about this and the role that whether private industry or the government plays, what I've always heard though is the cyber threat in large part is much more of a diplomacy issue than anything else, as we're seeing now more and more state-sponsored acts of terrorism. How have you seen that part of it evolve as well?
Complicated answer, but nation states, and I'll name them, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, are very capable adversaries in the cyberspace. They can disrupt critical infrastructure. We know that, and we've seen attributable attacks from them. But we also know intelligence services use covert action and covert campaigns to impact the United States or show us they have those capabilities. Russia comes to mind in this space, and their relationships with criminal organizations that are associated with their national security intelligence apparatus. So, we have to look at it this very closely, is what are the capabilities of adversaries? Have intelligence services train criminal organizations that capability? And then how can they attack the homeland, and what nodes are U.S. corporations in the U.S., and I say the homeland, or any U.S. corporation abroad, and where are the vulnerabilities out there, and how do we mitigate it? But it goes to something you brought up, is how does the insurance industry underwrite that risk? And what do they require of the corporations or businesses, or from a personal lines, my personal self, my residents, how do they protect us, and how do they price that? And I think that's the question I have for you is, again, understanding the threat and the risk and the capabilities of adversaries, and then how do you write for or set requirements to have personal security or good personal hygiene, personal cyber hygiene for a business or your own personal self? And how does the industry see that space and the evolution? Because like 9/11, a huge catastrophic event occurred, and then some pricing models came in after for the insurance industry. I'd hate to see major events occur and then something's after that, because I think we all know the risk is there. So Sean, what's your thoughts on that from the insurance industry's perspective on the cyber risk and underwriting?
Well, insurance is an industry that's built on protecting critical infrastructure, is the term that you've used and you're more familiar with. And as you well know, most of our critical infrastructure is not in the government, it's in the private sector. And in order for that infrastructure to be protected, they need insurance. And so the insurance industry touches every single part of our economy. I mentioned earlier about real estate and construction and what the impact was there on 9/11. Again, that impact shut down those industries at a time. It shows you the power of it. And that also then is worrisome as we think about cyber terrorism for insurance, because it's evolving. And we've got capital on hand for protecting what I would call your traditional type of events. But with cyber, we're learning every day, and it's changing every day. And that is where it becomes worrisome for insurers. We've got large amounts of capital on hand. But if you have an event and something, I personally worry about if a cyber event were to be as large as what we've seen, for example, in a pandemic, where it's touching so many different economies at the same time, that's where it becomes worrisome, because that's where it can become largely uninsurable. That's why a pandemic is largely uninsurable. Even we talked earlier about 9/11, and 9/11 being, something that every American, we were in Colorado, you and I were in Colorado at the time, but we felt the impact of it. But from an economic standpoint, really only New York and Washington, D.C. felt those impacts at that time in terms of economy. And those were cities, not just even whole states. But then you look at something like a pandemic or a large cyber event, even what we saw in terms of, in oil, the oil. I need to stop because I'm forgetting pipeline.
Pipeline.
Even what we saw most recently with the oil pipeline shutdown, you saw several different economies being impacted at the same time. Now, if there are terrorist events, cyber terrorist events that have a larger impact, this is where it becomes worrisome for insurers, because it's then not limited by time and geography, and that can be worrisome. Even this ransomware as an evolution of cyber attacks, we're seeing it has increased now 500% in the last 2 years. So certainly we're paying attention to that, and we're trying to understand, again, we're a data-driven industry. How do we evolve with this? So certainly cyber is something that we are underwriting in some ways, but we're also making sure that we're understanding how this is evolving, and it certainly is. I'm wondering from you, David, has the availability of insurance to pay ransoms, in your mind, helped or hurt with this ransomware trend we're seeing?
Well, that's as you know from the White House, that's a policy decision with the Department of Justice and the Attorney General weighing in. I will give my perspective, because I don't want to be too critical on the administration or the policies, but I'll give you my perspective on paying ransoms for terrorism that we saw when you were in the White House under President Bush 43, and as I was there as a counterterrorism special agent and in management at the FBI and working for the Department of Defense at times. That did result in further kidnappings of U.S. persons. We saw that significantly when ransoms were paid. It put us more at risk. We've got to think that, and the U.S. policy was we do not pay for ransoms. Private corporations, if you remember, the Somali pirates, which was really Al-Shabaab and East African Al-Qaeda, would hijack shipping vessels going around the Horn of Africa. The U.S. put special forces operators out there as a deterrent and as a force protection capability that were brought to bear with direct action and kinetic action against Al-Shabaab and East African Al-Qaeda to mitigate that threat. So we used all tools in the toolbox to target terrorists that were attacking our U.S. corporations and our U.S. persons abroad, and it was very effective. I think from a policy decision, we've got to come up with what are we going to do in this space where U.S. companies are being held ransom and we're paying those ransoms where, and then how do we track it if we are going to pay it with the cyber currency, which is problematic, is generally unregulated compared to the financial industry that you're familiar with and know your customer. Those all present challenges in this space that I think policymakers in Washington, congressmen and women, and the private sector need to come up with a good policy and legislation that is going to affect this clear vulnerability that we see over and over again.
Yeah, it's again what we're talking about the evolution of this and what it is. I mean, we're even seeing this evolve insofar as all of us, over the last year and a half have been working from home and questionable as to whether or not we had the right cyber protection all around us in our house as we needed it, which makes large corporations who the people are working for and small being vulnerable to more and more attacks. And again, this is where cyber terrorism becomes really challenging for insurers. Some in larger insurers especially have the capital on hand and are comfortable writing this risk, but as it's evolving, we're certainly seeing the assessment of the risk much more difficult to price and accordingly and make the right decisions in terms of how you offer protection to the consumer. And I agree with you. We've got to in some ways make it very clear as to what we need to do from a policy perspective. Coming through COVID, we realized very quickly that we didn't have any system in place to bring financial relief to consumers that were impacted by this pandemic that we're seeing. And as we're talking here today, we're in some ways paralleling what cyber could be economically if it were an event large enough to almost be like a pandemic. So again, it's a worry for insurers where they're working diligently to see how they can make the right decisions in terms of pricing the risk accordingly. But price is something that's a challenge as well for the consumer, because premiums on the cyber terrorism we're seeing go up 50%, and in some cases 100%. So consumers don't necessarily like to hear that, but you have to price the risk, price the insurance according to what the risk level is. And as we're talking here today, if we have more unknowns about cyber terrorism, and that provides less ability to underwrite the risk, and so that makes it harder and pricier, quite honestly, for the insurance products that we're having get out there. But at the same time, as much as there's a risk, there's also an opportunity, and the insurance industry is working to figure out ways that it can offer the right products, so that it can be in there to help the consumer overcome, be that financial first responder. But more and more, you're also seeing that they're having to be more explicit about what cyber means and whether or not it is covered. In fact, Lloyd's, which is one of the larger insurance market providers, has mandated that policies are actually now needing to explicitly state whether the cyber coverage is in there or not. So from your perspective, David, you're part of that group that's helping try and predict and prevent and helping law enforcement bring, that partnership between law enforcement and our industry and insurance. From your perspective, though, what should insurers be doing themselves to ensure optimal preparedness and resilience for their own companies and organizations?
Yeah, there's a couple answers in there, so I'll unpack it for the information sharing. So the Information Sharing and Analysis Center, called ISAC. You're probably familiar with the FS-ISAC. The Financial Sector Information Sharing and Analysis was one of the first ones stood up. It was actually myself and Assistant Secretary Leslie Ireland, former Assistant Secretary of Treasury, with Jim Clapper at the DNI, really pushed that model in partner with the Department of Homeland Security. So DHS now really owns the information sharing programmatics in the United States. So first thing is go to the DHS website and sign up for the Information Sharing and Analysis Center that affects your business. Let's get you into the door so you have that infrastructure to get real information from the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. Also, when it comes to crime and intelligence, the National Insurance Crime Bureau, that's what we do here. We bridge that gap. My senior management team is going to be people like myself, the head of intelligence. We also have insurance carrier. Our new CFO is going to come from the insurance industry. We're announcing that tomorrow, as well as my senior team, our former Assistant United States Attorney, a former Deputy Attorney General, and then 3 other senior executives from the FBI. So partner with us in this space. Many of you already do that. We're also aligned with this, how to get the intelligence to you, and then also fight cyber-related crimes that are causing losses to the insurance industry. But then 2 things that need to happen in a company. You need to protect yourselves, protect your brand, and protect your personnel. Make sure you have good internal cyber hygiene protocols and procedures, and you have the right experts that are either working for your company or you have it contracted out. And I won't mention any contracts by name, but there's very good organizations out there that can provide contract service. Second component is have a plan of action. If an attack occurs, what is the break glass moment? What are you going to do to protect yourself and your own personnel? The second component to that is, how are you getting the information from an insurance perspective to underwrite the risk? If we're waiting for the data and analysis to come on these risks, it's going to be after an event. I would hate to see multiple catastrophic events and the losses occur. If there's information already out there by the US government or law enforcement organizations, it can help mitigate that up front. And then from the underwriting perspective, and Sean, you mentioned, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this further, is the requirement, if you're going to underwrite a policy, to have some sort of cyber hygiene, critical nodes that you must have if I'm going to underwrite you. If I was a carrier, what are the requirements you have? Do you have a cybersecurity plan? Do you have a preparedness plan? Are there basic requirements that we're going to have that you must have to be underwritten? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that and where the industry is. It seems like the industry is all over in that place and are trying to get there, but maybe not where they need to be.
Well, I think this is a good reflection, Dave, of kind of this evolution that we're talking about in terms of evolving into more of a resilient focus method of insuring. Because it's a two-way street here when it comes to cyber. And more you are seeing partnerships with insurance companies and tech companies that can come in and actually assess the risk, close the windows, if you will, that are open and vulnerable to cyber attacks. So that's one area where we're seeing a trend of insurance companies working to come in first and figure out, assess what the cyber risk potential is, close the windows, create more security, update different policies and procedures, make sure that the insureds have plans in place to ensure that they have their data protected. They're making the right disclosures, those types of things. And when you have that in place, then it does make it easier to underwrite. And so again, the insurance industry is more and more working with the insureds to ensure that there's protection measures in place so that, again, you can underwrite the risk at a lower price level, which is more comfortable, but at the same time you're reducing you're reducing the risk itself and creating more of a pattern of resiliency, which is becoming more and more important. Because we're talking here today about cyber and terrorism, but obviously we're seeing other risks evolve as our population increases and population moves into more danger-prone areas. We've got to figure out ways that we can promote resiliency in different ways. So that's an overall trend we're seeing with cyber, but we're also seeing it again with infrastructure insurance and all types of things, as we're right here in the heat of a hurricane season and seeing the devastation from hurricanes and seeing infrastructure literally collapse that we need to rebuild. We have to begin to rebuild these in a way that's more resilient to withstand the risks that are evolving in many different ways beyond even just cyber. But from your perspective, David, I was interested. I wanted to kind of go back to what we were talking about originally when we came here in about 9/11. What in your mind are parallels today that you're seeing that we also had during that time, or before, I should even say, 9/11?
I think the evolution of terrorism in parallels that are concerning to me, and I won't comment on the policies of our withdrawal from Afghanistan, but as you know, we now have a state sponsor of terrorism. The Taliban is now running a country no different than Iran and North Korea. That is gravely concerning to me, and it's an ungoverned space. We already know ISIS is an occupier in that space, and they have capability. I think we are in a much better space. Not even I think, I know that we have a global layered approach to how we collect data, how we partner with other nations to identify risk to the US, cyber or terrorism, how we vet people that are coming into the United States, how we vet supply chains and goods that are coming to the United States. The enhanced screening and vetting, or extreme vetting, a term that was used before, is a good thing. It was bipartisan, putting aside some of the policy and political rhetoric that came. There was bipartisan in the national security space that enhanced screening and vetting is good for the United States. And our partnership with our global partners on terrorism and national security threats is more important than ever as we withdraw from Afghanistan and come back home. But I am concerned that we have an ungoverned space that is being now run by a designated terrorist organization, no different than North Korea and Iran. That is going to be problematic, and we're going to have to be more focused than ever on that layered approach. It is not a military approach. It's a national security approach that involves all components of that, 17 organizations, including the military, but also in partnership with the private sector. But there is going to be risk from that, and it can be mitigated with good policies, strategies, and operationalizing of that.
Yeah. Well, one thing we know for sure, and I think you and I agree on, is that this cyber risk issue is certainly continuing to evolve, and it is going to be a dominant issue for us as we will face in terms of a global threat. We're in for very interesting times ahead. Hopefully we are getting ourselves in a better place with things like we're talking about in terms of ensuring that the government and the private industry are working hand in hand to predict, to prevent, and to promote resilience in this area. But I would also argue we have a ways to go still. And so there, but we do know one thing, that the insurance industry is very interested in making sure that it can stay on top of this risk and work with its consumers to protect and make sure that we maintain economic stability throughout this type of crisis or catastrophe and many others. So, David, I really want to thank you. It's always great to see you, always great to learn from you, which I do every time we talk. And I'd like to just thank all of you for attending this executive exchange from III. I'm Sean Kevelighan.